Hi everybody, I'm Nikki, and I'm presenting the results of my research project, What's in a Name? Naming Practices in Online Video Games. Names are often the first piece of identification we share when meeting someone, vocative phrases we use to get someone's attention, and symbols we use to refer to individuals when they're not present. Character creation at the player level is often a time-consuming process where players adjust sliders, experiment with color palettes, and perfect their character's overall appearance. Here are several examples of human-female character customization screens from several massively multiplayer online games. The visual presentation of the character varies depending on the aesthetic of the game, the squash and stretch of the avatar, and the degree of customizability within the creator. However, even with the immense variation between these different character creators, all of these games share one similar customization option: the name. Choosing a name is the final piece of the character creation process. One of the reasons the name is so important is because there are so many situations in-game where their physical representation of the character is not present, such as chat channels, private messages, and in-game mail. Some gaming-related spaces, such as voice-over IP programs, forums, and third-party sites, also prevent players from being identified by their embodied character. Instead, the character name is the only identifier to associate with a player in these spaces, which makes choosing a name a very important decision. While a lot of previous research has looked at the purposes and functions embodied characters serve in the player-character relationship, most of this research overlooks the character name. Previous research suggests that players use their characters as a way to create idealized versions of themselves. Bessier et al. And Duchesneau et al. Found that players viewed their characters as more attractive, more socially adjusted, and overall closer to an ideal version of themselves than the players were. Bessier claimed that the fantasy elements of online video games, quote, free the players from the yoke of their real-life history and social situation, allowing them to be more like the person they wish they were. However, we found players had very different experiences to their character names than their physical characters. Our players emphasized the importance of character names as identity objects, or tools that they use to identify themselves, to develop a persistent identity, means to maintain social relationships, and symbols to express their identity and interests. We performed a deep qualitative study of what character names mean to players and the ways in which character names allowed players to present a sincere self rather than an idealized self. We conducted semi-structured interviews with 20 participants to discuss the process of character name creation, the origins of players' character names, and the functions character names serve players. All participants were considered gaming veterans, or they currently played at least one online game, or considered themselves somebody with an extensive history of online gaming. Participants were not recruited based on any information about their naming practices, only on their experiences with online games and character creation. After data collection, we needed some theory to explain and analyze our findings about the practices players discussed. Gottlob Frege was a German philosopher and logician during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, known for his work on the philosophy of language and mathematics. Part of what was useful from Frege's work was his discussion of the sense and reference of proper names. According to Frege, sense are the meanings, connotations, and associations a name has beyond a direct referent, and reference is the specific object or subject to which a name refers. We use sense and reference to analyze players' practices of creating and maintaining character names, specifically how players embed sense into names when they create them, and why players maintain reference across contexts reusing names. We separated players' discussions of their character names in terms of names as reference and meaning in names. Names as reference included character names as identity objects, persistent reference of identity in online gaming, and persistent reference of identity in non-gaming spaces. Meaning in names included creating a name that alluded to other media and fit a gamer character. Though we did not mention the term identity during interviews, many participants quickly discussed their character name in relation to their identity. In this way, character names functioned as identity objects for players to represent themselves. Players frequently describe their character names as just as important as their real names. As one participant said, "It's as much a name for me as my name in real life. It's part of my name, part of my identity." Having a regularly used name taken or unavailable in a new game was a very frustrating experience for players. However, instead of creating an entirely new name, most players had solutions to maintain the integrity of their original name through slight alterations, such as using phonetically similar letters like X's and Z's, I's and E's. In this case, it's a silent letter. Adding additional letter, this goes along with the previous example, it was often an extra syllable or silent letter within a name. Adding prefixes or suffixes, so these were additional words or phrases tacked on at the beginning or end of a name. A lot of players use this to tie all of their alts together under one player. Or repeating the name, and this generally only worked for shorter names because of character limit restrictions. Most players worked very hard to keep their original name or a name that shared similarities to their original name across games because they had developed a sense of identification with that name, and reusing a name allowed them to be identifiable with other players in new games. The importance of character names as identity objects was often mentioned in regard to common names, such as names from Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings characters, or iterations of these names with special characters or accents. In these cases, the concern surrounded reference ambiguity. One player elaborated on this concept. Why call yourself something that you could get mixed up with somebody else? You can do it if you want, but you might get mistaken for a person, they might get mistaken for you. The player notes the ways in which common fantasy names defeated the purpose of having a character name that accurately identifies another player, and could cause confusion when trying to reconnect with a player in a new game. Character names were often used in order to be identifiable to others, maintain a cohesive gaming history through a persistent identity, and sustain relationships across games. Stories about finding old gaming buddies or groups by reusing a character name in a new game were surprisingly abundant. One player explained his experience using one name across several games. I've had people recognize me across games. I was in a big guild when I played Dark Ages of Camelot for a long time, and in both World of Warcraft and when I played Warhammer Online, I ran across other players who saw my name and were like, "Oakbeard, did you play Dark Ages of Camelot? Were you in this guild?" Who recognized me, and then I fell in with them. The character's physical appearance continues to change as the player gets new weapons and armor. As seen earlier, even creating a character with the same race and gender combination does not allow you to perfectly recreate a character in a new game. For these reasons, some players argued that the character name was more important than the physical character because, as one participant said, the name is something you're stuck with for a long time. You can cover yourself with armor if you're hideous. The idea that you're stuck with a name was prevalent in our interviews. Some players were still referred to by a character name even after they had stopped using the character or deleted the character entirely. Regardless of the availability of name changes in many contemporary online games, choosing a name was frequently considered a permanent decision. Another reason character names were so important was because players frequently took them offline. Many players used character names to refer to themselves or others beyond the game world and into social media and offline spaces. One participant discussed the ways in which her character name had become like a nickname for her offline. Katomi, my main character in World of Warcraft, a lot of people still refer to me as Katomi or Koto or variations of that name. Real life friends and people I text often. I know I'm in people's phones as Katomi still, even after the advent of Facebook. Calling somebody by one name, whether real name, nickname, or character name, creates a relationship with that individual under that name. When a relationship started in-game, players often preferred to use the character name for the other person, even if a real name was visible or used by others. This happened in several situations, including phone contacts, Facebook, offline meetups, and offline relationships. Some participants we talked to had relationships outside of games with other players for years and still referred to each other by their character names. In this sense, the name, unlike the physical representation of the character, has a life of its own. The name carries a player's history across contexts and becomes associated with the player in a way that the physical representation of the character cannot. Players considered a name the most customizable part of a character, and thus the appropriate vehicle with which to express meaning and represent their identity. As one participant said, your name gives an impression in people's minds about who you are. So when you have a character name, it's one of the first things you see, and you see it all the time, and it's one of the few things that you can completely customize, barring offensive language. It's of larger importance than other aspects of customization. We discovered that players developed rich meaning through their character names by embedding connotations and associations with a specific word, concept, media reference, or style into the name itself. The following behaviors and patterns describe what Frege referred to as the sense of a name. Players sometimes drew inspirations for their names from sources external to a game, such as foreign languages, literature, and pop culture references. Books, comics, movies, TV shows, and music were frequently source material for creating names. The examples listed here are all actual names our players used in online games. One participant discussed why she used slight alterations on names from popular media. If I think someone within WoW will understand or know the fandom, my name will be close enough to the actual name that they'll get it, just hoping that they'll maybe chat about it if we happen to be in a party together, or if you're just walking around in the main city, maybe somebody will bring up the topic, or sometimes it's to show that I'm a fan. Players mentioned the special functions having an allusion in the name served. Allusions to popular media were useful for social interactions, a way to start conversations, and icebreakers for finding people who shared their interests. Sometimes players found that a character name unintentionally alluded to some other media. One player had used the name Morrigan for his female characters for over 20 years from his days when he started playing Dungeons & Dragons. He originally intended the name to evoke the sense of the goddess from Celtic mythology with the same name. However, when Morrigan from Darkstalkers and Morrigan from Dragon Age series became popular figures in media, he stopped using the name, fearing that his intended meaning of Morrigan would be muddled or misinterpreted. In many of these cases, players deleted or abandoned their characters because they felt the name no longer sincerely represented them. While character deletion may seem like a drastic measure, names the player felt ambivalent about were frequently mentioned as reasons for abandoning or recreating a lower-level character. In fact, we were surprised to find that even for some higher-level characters, many players were more willing to completely delete the character rather than pay for a name change. Fit was a concept that continually appeared in our interviews. According to our players, fit meant a name did not break immersion and could plausibly occur somewhere within the game world. One player discussed the concept of fit in terms of both game aesthetic and character purpose. I won't name a super robot something high fantasy sounding unless it's also a high fantasy setting. And then by reverse, I won't name a high fantasy character something robotic sounding or use terminology that wouldn't be used for that setting. So lore is a big part. The style of the character is important too. So if I'm playing a sneaky character, I try to find a sneaky name. If I'm playing a big strong character, I do something that sounds like a big strong character. Our players worked to create character names that fit within the contextual aesthetics of the game, whether this was the aesthetics of the game world, the cultural history of the character's race, or the practical functionality of the character's class. Having a name that fit was considered a good indication of understanding the game and the appropriate social norms. Frequently, players drew on their knowledge of previous game elements to inform which names appropriately fit a character in a new game. It was not uncommon to hear a player talk about a beloved name, but then follow it up with, "But I could never name a character with this class with that name." Here are two examples of participants justifying whether a name fit for their character. I usually try to fit a little bit of both class and race, like Crom, for example, Orc Warrior. If he was maybe an Orc Shaman, I wouldn't name him Crom because it just doesn't really fit the Shaman. If I was playing WoW, I wouldn't name a Paladin Drain, because I picked Drain purely because I was a Warlock in that game. In both cases, players discussed elements of a character's race or class as a deciding factor for determining if a name fit. Players argued that using race or class-specific material in a name provided information in situations where others could not see their embodied character. One participant succinctly described how much time players can invest in name creation to ensure a name appropriately fit a character. This example describes a player's experience with a Pandaren, a race in World of Warcraft with distinctively Chinese cultural elements. For example, on the Pandaren, I spent probably 2 nights working on those names. I wanted the names to fit them, and I'm not very familiar with Chinese, and then I wanted to make sure the Chinese names that I looked up were accurate and not something else entirely, because you never want to offend somebody by picking a name that means something awful or look like an idiot. Naming allows a character to become more than just an assortment of pixels that result from customization sliders and preset facial options. By giving a character a name, players have creative control over the cultivation of a sense the name evokes for others. Some proposals, such as Blizzard's attempt to convert to the Real ID system and Facebook's recent crusade against drag queens' usage of stage names, miss the importance of an identity that is not tied to a real name. While this is not the case in all online contexts, such as Reddit, where the use of multiple names is common and socially acceptable, in online games and related spaces, the use of a persistent pseudonymous identity is an important nuance of the gaming experience. Using a character name as a personal identifier gives players agency over the amount of information they disclose to others. For example, female and transgender players are 2 minority groups that are at risk for experiencing harassment if their gender identity is revealed. One of the redeeming qualities of the internet is that it affords the possibility to carefully manage one's identity. Some countries monitor and regulate people with certain orientations, such as religious affiliations, political opinions, racial backgrounds, or gender expressions. Individuals with the wrong characteristics may be subject to legal action if their identity is revealed. For example, in 2010, Nardi found that Chinese World of Warcraft players frequently embedded controversial political opinions into their character names. This would not be possible if the characters were all united under a player's legal name, and in many of these cases, the players would force legal action if they were identified. Pseudonyms allow people to protect themselves online and to express aspects of their identity that they deem appropriate at a given point in time. Players care about having control over their names. While forcing the use of legal names is not currently a problem in online gaming, we believe the ability to choose a name should be offered in other online contexts as well. The distinctive ways in which our study participants manage their online identities supports our argument that we should allow players to use whatever name they choose and to craft their identities according to the specific venue they are in, whether games, Reddit, or anywhere else. Gamers are aware of the power of names, and this study shows how much work a carefully chosen name can do for a player in terms of social relationships and identity expression. In some way, these affordances allow chosen pseudonymous names to surpass given real names as identity objects. We advocate that internet policy take a page from gaming and give users free rein to call themselves whatever they prefer within the bounds of acceptability within the community that they participate. We have demonstrated that character naming is frequently a time-consuming and intensive process and functions as a way for players to convey information about their identity to others. Our findings do not suggest that arguments about the character as an idealized self are wrong, but that they are not the entire story. Instead, we propose that the player-character relationship include character names in addition to the player and the embodied character. A player's relationship to their physical character can differ greatly from their relationship to their character name, but examining these various dynamics is important for a more comprehensive understanding of the player-character relationship. And I can take any questions now. Thank you.